Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to start talking about the second point in our module, which is how do we actually measure change, right? So we've talked about sort of what types of change, sort of the categories we can look for, change, no change, type of change, magnitude of change, cause of change. Right, now I want to talk about some of the actual methods that we use to measure change. And specifically, we're going to talk about three methods. This is not mutually exclusive. There are many, many, many methods, and even many sort of specific implementations of the methods that I'm going to talk about in this next section of the module. But what I want to do is I want to cover three sort of categories of methods, and I want to give each method its own video so that hopefully you can really get an understanding of the intricacies involved um, with each method. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the ways to measure change. Right. So this is not we're now not talking about how do we categorize it. We're talking about what do we actually do? How do we actually use remote sensing information to handle these change detections? There's really two broad categories, and then within these broad categories, we're going to talk about specific implementations. So the first is called map to map. All right, so map to map is the idea that we have two different classifications and we're comparing how those results change between the two time periods. And again, right, this goes back to that example that I talked about when we were talking about the before and after type of change. This would be where you would look at time one and say, okay, this pixel's forest. You would look at time two and you would say, oh, well, now this pixel is crop. So you would be able to say both that change occurred, right, because it's no longer forest, but you'd also be able to say that the before after, oh, it changed, from forest to crop. So map to map, sort of to recap that in just a sentence here, right, it involves comparing classifications between two time periods. Okay. So I want to just quickly look at a stylized example. All right, let's say we have this simplistic, get that a little bit straighter. All right, let's say we have this simplistic example. This is time one. Right. And this is time two. So in this specific sort of stylistic example, right, we have 9 pixels, and we'll say we have 5 classes. So we have forest in green, we have crops in yellow, right? We have water in blue, and then we'll say we have urban in red. Right, so you might imagine we've got some forest up here, got some water, right, maybe some crops in some places, and then we've got some urban areas as well. Right, so at time one, right, our classification looks something like this. So you might imagine in time two, right, maybe we've got something like this. Right, so you can see just visually looking at these, right, we do have change. We have change here, we have change here, right? And so an output, right, an output might look something like this, right? And there's two different ways we could do this. Right, change, no change. Right, change, no change. You might have a 0 if there's change and a 1 if there, or a 0 if there's no change and a 1 if there is. And you might color code it. Green means change, right? Red means no change. Right, so you could have something like this in the output, right? We had change here, right? Because again, we went from forest to crop, so there was change here. Because again, we're comparing the pixel. Time 1 compared to time 2. If there was change, right, we mark it as change. Okay. And we have change here, right? It changed from crop to urban. So we would mark that as change as well. And then no change, right? All the other places there was no change. Right. So typically, there's nothing special about green and red here, right? You could do black and white, you could do purple and yellow, right? The colors don't matter. What matters is that we have this binary output of change, no change. And all we're doing is comparing the map classes. If they're the same, then we have no change. If they're different, then we have change. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. Because there's another way that we could do this, right? So this was the change, no change method, right? Another way that we could do this would be the before after. Right? So with before after, right? If it's no change, right, we could call that a 0. Right? And then if it was forest to crop, we could call that a 1. Right? If it's crop to forest, call that a 2. Right? If it's urban to crop, call that 3, right? If it's crop to urban, right, we call that a 4, right? If it's, I'm trying to make sure that at a minimum I include the ones we have. So we went from crop to urban, we went from forest to crop, right? And we could say if it went from forest to water, call that a 5, etc., etc., etc. Right? So now not only do we have this binary change, no change, right? No change being 0, but if we have change, right, now we're specifying what type of change happened, right? If it went from forest to crop, we assign the pixel a 1, right? If we go from crop to forest, we call it a 2. If we go from urban to crop, we call it 3. If we go from forest to water, we call it a 5. And you can imagine this going on and on and on relative to the number of map classes that we have. So each sort of unique combination represents a different output. I know that's a little confusing, so I want to go back and I want to repeat. Right? If we have no change, right? If it's forest to forest, if it's water to water, if it's urban to urban, right? We might classify that as a 0. Right? Any other type of change now is not just going to be called change, right? It's going to be given a unique number based on which type of change it was. Forest to crop, right? We'd call this 1. Crop to forest, we'd call this 2. Urban to crop, we call this 3. Right? Now, I want to make clear here, these numbers, I'm making them up, right? Forest to crop doesn't have to be 1. It could be 1,000 for all we care. The only thing we care about is that each combination gets a unique identifier so that in the output, when you see a pixel, you can find the value and go back and figure out what type of change, right? What it was before and what it was after. So let's just quickly look at what this would look like. So this would look like 0 here, right? Because there's no change. 0 here because there's no change. 0 here because there's no change. 0 here because there's no change. 0 here, 0 here, and 0 here, right? Because just like change, no change, right? Anywhere that no change occurred, we're calling that a 0 in the output. Anywhere that change did occur, right, these 2 pixels, now we have to figure out what change happened. So we look here and we compare to here. Right, so going from here to here, we see that we went from forest to crop. Right, so now we look down here and we say, okay, forest to crop, we give this a value of 1. We look here, we see we went from crop to urban. So we look at our list, urban to crop, no. Crop to urban, yep. So we're going to give this a 4. Okay? Now, when you see the results in ArcGIS Pro or some other viewing software, what you'll typically see is something like this. Right? You'll see something like this. And again, I'm just sort of picking colors at random here. Right, and you'll see something like no change. Right, crop to urban. And then yellow was forest to crop. Right, again, there's nothing special about these colors. I picked them at random. There's nothing inherently special about these numbers. I picked them at random. The important part is that each number represents a specific set of change, and forest to crop is not the same as crop to forest, right? So the output's going to be numbers. Again, because we're dealing with imagery, those numbers will be displayed with colors, and the colors, again, will be at random. The important part is that there's a key that goes from the color to the number, from the number to whatever the change is. So again, change, no change, if it changed, if it didn't. Before, after, right, we have the different types of change being called out specifically. Hopefully this makes sense. And as always, please reach out. Thank you.